access to genetic diagnostics. As a legal intern at the Cleveland Clinic, I have been keenly aware of the power and ultimate necessity for license agreements, especially when viewed in light of the patent bargain and an interest in delivering basic life sciences research to the bedside. Dr. Cook-Deegan is the director of the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy at Duke University. He is also the author of over 200 publications, including a myriad amicus brief offered in support of neither party, as well as Gene Wars, Science, Politics, and the Human Genome, a novel that weighs the ethical concerns raised by the Human Genome Project. His most recent research highlights how patents do not necessarily inhibit the public's access to genetic diagnostic. Please join me in welcoming the renowned health policy investigator, Dr. Cook-Deegan.
So we're going to switch gears, and my guess is, I don't know how you guys decided this was going to be the topic for the symposium this year, but I'm guessing that probably the lawsuit that was filed in May of 2009 by the American Civil Liberties Union and the Public Patent Foundation probably has something to do with why we're sitting here today. I'm going to broaden the topic beyond just the BRCA case, but I am going to touch on it, and I'm going to use it as one model and contrast it with some other models of gene patenting and how they're used in the real world. Before I do that, though, since I knew I was going to be talking to students, they're the ones who did the lion's share of the work I'm going to be talking about. This is one picture of a subset of the folks that are on this slide, and actually I need to do a new slide. We have about twice as many people that have worked over time. And all these people that are used, those are the undergraduates. They've all graduated. You'll be sad to know only one of them went to law school. 4 of them have gone to medical school. One is trying to be an opera singer, and 2 have PhDs in English now. And our dog hasn't graduated. So I'm going to do some space, kind of the 30,000 foot stuff, and then I'm going to drill down and talk about gene patents more specifically, and then I'll go back up to the level of policy through this lecture. There is a fair amount of intellectual property that has been granted in the United States, and foreign jurisdictions haven't been quite as energetic, haven't created quite as many, granted quite as many patents, but this is a year-by-year grant of patents that have 1 or more claims that say something about DNA or RNA. And it's a really cool thing about genomics and genetics that you can do the science, you can follow publications, you can follow grants, and you can follow patents in a way that it's hard to do in other areas. So if you're John Allison or Artie Ryan, you want to study software, it's really harder, much harder to do this kind of count, because you actually have to hand read the patents. In DNA and RNA, we can actually use terms that are very exquisitely sensitive and specific to DNA and RNA and pull the patents out into a sub-collection. That's what this is a measure of. I just checked. The last update of the DNA patent database was the 13th of this month, and there were about 57,000 patents that have been granted in the United States. So at $20,000 to get a patent in the US, that's something on the order of $1 billion have been spent on getting pieces of paper that say, I can block you from making, using, selling, or whatever of this invention that is based in some way on DNA. So we've created a lot of intellectual property, and we're going to be telling some of the stories about what's been done with that intellectual property. Here are the classes of litigation. So the reason you get a patent right is it's a license to sue. If somebody does the thing that you have claimed, if they make, use, sell, or import the invention that you've claimed in your patent, you can sue them, and you use the federal court system to do that. This is Chris Coleman's count of how many times that has happened, and the white lines are how many cases in each category. And I show this only because I want to point out that in DNA diagnostic testing, 0 of those cases had ever actually gotten before a judge until the current case that we'll be talking about later. He did this study before the patent litigation that's going on now was filed. So what we have is, and look at it, the most cases that we see here are unsurprisingly in the area of therapeutics. Now, why is that? And what is a DNA patent doing in that space? what DNA is doing in that space is basically protecting a manufacturing process. You're using DNA as the code to make something that you're going to put in a bottle and sell for high amounts of money. And it's pretty obvious that there's some engineering involved in that. And the hand of man is pretty heavily involved. If you clone a gene and then put it in a cell, grow up the cells, they produce this stuff, you purify the stuff you really want to sell for high prices out of that mix, and you put it in a bottle and sell it. So there's a lot of steps, a lot of engineering, and DNA is doing something. It's very high up in the value chain, but it is one of the choke points that you can patent to stop the rest of anybody else from intruding on the rest of that space. And that's the model that we got used to in connection with the first generation of gene patents. What's different about the new set of cases is that they're about a different use of DNA. And that is, if you're doing diagnosis, you're trying to take the information in a person's cells or a tissue sample, and you're trying to gather the information about whether they have a mutation or not to predict what's going to happen to the biology of that particular human being. And what you're trying to do, therefore, is actually copy the information that is in that person's body. You're not trying to engineer a product and put it back in that body through a complicated engineering process. That's why Judge Sweet was confronted with a whole different set of questions when he came up on this case. And I think it guides why he has dropped the bombshell. All of the folks sitting in classrooms like this had a very different lecture on gene patents 2 years ago than they're getting these days. And they'll get a very different one when the Court of Appeals begins to reverse this process sometime later this year. Now, another context-setting point here. It turns out that while there hasn't been much litigation, as Chris Holman has shown, there has been a lot of controversy. And interestingly, the controversy doesn't map very closely to the litigation. Most of the litigation has been settled about therapeutics, but there actually hasn't been much press attention to, there wasn't a whole lot of controversy over Amgen cloning EPO or Neupogen. They're two blockbuster drugs that made them a company and turned them into a baby pharma. Or when Genentech patented and marketed insulin and sold it through Lilly. Horrendous amount of litigation there, right? The UC Lilly was a consolidation of 6 cases that cost $30 million. But it wasn't a big public controversy. It was something that only the folks in this room would care about, right? A very small subfraction of the population. It generated some headlines, and most of those headlines were, "Isn't cloning cool? Isn't it really cool that you can use recombinant DNA to actually do something good for people?" There has, however, been a lot of literature about and controversy, intense controversy, about diagnostic uses of patents, and it goes back a decade. This is from 2 different sets of analyses done by the folks at University of Alberta. Tim Caulfield's the lead author on the papers. One was a review of all the policy documents that have been written all over the world: Canada, the United States, Australia, Europe, UK, Nuffield Council. And the other is a list of English language literature, that is US, Australia, United Kingdom, New Zealand, looking at all the newspaper articles that have been published about gene patents and looking at them. And this is one of those slides you shouldn't show. This is actually from a paper where you can read it. I apologize for those in the back of the room. The only thing you need to know here is there's a big splotch on the left on each of these bars, and the big splotches are either breast cancer or BRCA, and we lump those together here. So the only point here is that of the controversies, and there's been a lot of controversy connected to patenting of genes in the diagnostic context, almost all of that has been driven by one case that we're going to come back to, and that's been testing for inherited risk of breast and ovarian cancer in the BRCA genes. The second condition actually was Alzheimer's on the bottom and hemochromatosis on the top. That's policy versus newspapers. So Alzheimer's disease is very popular in the popular press, and in policy circles there was more concern about hemochromatosis, and then everything drops off after that. So I've already made that point. So now this is a symposium about gene patents, so I'm going to show you some claims that are coming out of them, and I want to make a few points. I'm going to show 2 slides like this, and you know this, you've all taken IP law. There are 2 categories of claims to oversimplify. One is you're patenting the molecule. You're saying DNA is a chemical, and I'm patenting it. And you may specify that, and there are different ways of trying to do that. But you're patenting the molecule. And I've got 2 examples of kind of first generations of trying to do this, both of which have been enforced, were highly controversial, and did lead to litigation. One is Canavan's, and the other is one of the BRCA case patents that is in dispute in the current case. What you'll see in the BRCA thing, and I've highlighted the things that I think are doing the most work. Although I didn't highlight isolated, and I probably should have, because that's probably where the case is going to turn when if and when it ever finally reaches steady state or some sort of equilibrium. But I wanted to point out something that's related to the last lecture, surprisingly. If you look at the structure, and I've picked only 3 of the claims from the BRCA case. Claim 2 is the one that's kind of natural, that would flow out of the science that they did. So what did they do? They found a gene by looking for women that had a known high risk, and they compared it to other people in the same families who didn't have breast cancer, but had a lot of the same other genes. So they're trying to isolate risk of breast cancer with which mutations and which sequences have been inherited from mom and dad. And you're looking for mom and dad, which one had the cancer, usually mom, but sometimes dad. And you're looking for the mutation that they had that shows up in the other person in that family that got the disease, and you find the sequence. That's how you find the sequence. And then you claim the gene of which that sequence is a part. So you find the mutation, and then you say, and I'm going to claim the whole gene. So that's what claim 2 is. It's the DNA molecule that encodes the polypeptide that would be made by that gene. The move that was interesting here is from going from claim 2 to claim 1. Claim 1 is your broadest thing. It's your main independent claim, right? What they did is they didn't want to just claim that, because you could just go in and fiddle with a few nucleotides and get the same protein out. So they wanted to account for the degeneracy of the code. And they did that in a clever way. They said, well, we'll go to the amino acid sequence, and we'll claim any DNA molecule that would encode the thing that's really doing all the work. So that's an interesting move. It's a very clever patent lawyer trick. Interesting problem, though. If you keep doing that, modern molecular biology tells us that the same sequences may make multiple peptides. And if all sorts of lawyers have been doing the same trick, you're going to end up with overlapping patents that are hitting the same objects in the real world. And so you're going to have a problem. That problem, one example of a form of that problem is actually claim 5 here, which is any 15 nucleotides taken out of any of the degenerate codes from claim 1. So think about that. What they have done in claim 5 here is they have claimed a protein has lots and lots of amino acids. If you've got 15 nucleotides, that means you've got 5 amino acids. Did I say that right? 15 nucleotides mapped because there are 3 codons for each amino acid, right? So any sequence of 5 amino acids from any protein that map to 5 amino acids from any part of the BRCA1 gene are going to infringe this claim. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, it turns out that even the day they filed this patent application, they hit several 100,000 other sequences that were already deposited in GenBank. Probably not going to withstand scrutiny of a court. Who knows, because courts do what they do. But probably won't withstand scrutiny. And why would that be? Well, because it wouldn't be novel. It would fall afoul of the novelty criterion for what you can get in a claim. But there are all sorts of other possible complications that don't map to the new biology, and yet what we have is patents that were frozen in time at the time that we thought we knew what something was doing. I won't go into it, but you will see in the Canavan case, you've got the 16 nucleotide, which has got the same problem as the 15 nucleotide claim. And my only point here is lawyers began to go after claiming the things that were being discovered in labs, and they followed kind of a similar template. So when you find a problem, it's going to be replicated through the patent system, because lawyers are borrowing each other's patent claiming strategies. So I'm going to do a bit of a chronology, and then I'm going to shift back to a different kind of claim, the method claims, in just a second. But this is just to remind you, we've already talked about the Chakrabarty case. I commend to you, any of you who are really interested in this, go back and read Dan Kevlis's article on the history of the Chakrabarty case. And from the exchange this morning, we now see Chakrabarty as the dawning of a new era, but it was a 5-4 decision, guys. One Supreme Court justice changing their mind would have flipped the case the other direction. It was a very close call, and a lot of the things that people were worried about in arguments against Chakrabarty actually came to happen in the real world. Please notice that. That said, in retrospect, it seems like it was a pretty cool thing, and it was pretty smart to leave the doors open for patenting living matter, because all sorts of good things have happened in the real world. And I think folks in biotech rightly think that it was a landmark in their field and opened the door to getting patent protection for things that they needed to have patent protection on in our system of developing products and services for the medical markets. But another reason for having this slide is to point out that it has been controversial at very high levels. Senator Hatfield was worried about gene patents from the time that CETUS went public in the early 80s. Following the extreme success of Genentech in raising capital a few months before. In Belgium and France, they actually passed statutory laws that created compulsory licensing authority and to some extent a diagnostic use exemption for gene patents. And this is in direct response to what was going on in the controversies related to BRCA. It predated those controversies, but when BRCA controversy ignited in the late 1980s with the first spate of lawsuits that were initiated by Myriad, countries responded to it. And there were policy reports done in 2002 in the UK, 2 reports, one by the Nuffield Council, which is specific, and a more general one from their IP Commission, and then 3 reports from the Australian Law Reform Commission. That has come back again. There's a Senate inquiry that just ended, and I don't know what's going to happen in Australia, but it's a hot issue. Myriad has relinquished one of its patents. They're going to be asked to relinquish some others. So we don't know what's going to happen in Australia. But now I'm going to drill down for a second on what's happening in the United States. Last year was a big year. A year ago, next week, the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Genetics, Health, and Society released a report they'd been working on since 2006, and they recommended 2 things that I think are relevant for our discussion today. One was a diagnostic use exemption, probably their most controversial recommendation, and the other a research exemption. That is, if you've got something and you're patenting a DNA sequence, you should not be allowed to enforce it against people who are using it for research purposes. That's recommendation 1, and recommendation 2 is for diagnostic purposes. So these are carve-outs of use enforcement domains that have been put forward as possible policy solutions. At the time the report came out, Bio and Autumn, the 2 organizations, biotech organizations, and the university technology managers got together, held a press conference the night before the recommendations were approved, and said, we hate this report, we hate the recommendations, and we're against it. And I think a month later, they might have thought that the recommendations were a little bit more reasonable because on March 29th, as you all know, Judge Sweet made his decision rendered his ruling on the BRCA case and flipped the world of gene patenting law on its head, at least temporarily. I'm going to shift gears again and then go back to the theme. I'm going to leave you on the precipice there for just a second because I want to talk about another set of claims that are not about the DNA molecule, but turn out to be actually more problematic. If you take a list of all the problem claims that look like they might block use of a diagnostic technology in this space, you're much more likely to come across patent claims like this on this slide than the composition of matter claims. That's usually because composition of matter claims are structured in a way that they're fairly specific. You have to define the thing. Whereas here you're talking about an approach to doing something. And basically, my reading of these claims is that Myriad now has exclusive rights to take a sequence and compare it to a reference sequence and notice if there's a difference. I think this is a very wordy way of saying that. And that's not specific to a particular methodology. It's not specific to doing what they do in their lab, which is PCR up all sorts of segments, stitch them together into a complete sequence. This is pretty much any way that you would ever find out the sequence of BRCA1 and compare it to a reference sequence, you're going to be infringing this claim. I think it's an open question. There are really good arguments on both sides of whether claims like this should be allowed at all. And I have no clue what the courts are going to do with this. And we may have, it's going to take a while, and it would be really, really, really useful to know how the courts are going to interpret claims like this, because there are a lot of them. And these are actually the claims that really matter, the method claims. This is not the part of Judge Sweet's ruling that got a lot of attention, but there is a section, 8 pages out of that 158 say something about method claims, and he basically said they don't pass muster. And I don't know what the CAFC is going to do with it if they even touch it. This is the second claim is taken from my own university's patent on Alzheimer's disease, which basically I think is a mental act claim, basically. Any way that you want to measure the genotype of a person and predict the risk of Alzheimer's disease is going to infringe this claim. It seems unlikely to me that courts are going to tolerate this kind of stuff, but they did. They've granted it, and these patents have been enforced for years. I don't know if this kind of claim is going to survive or not, but this is the high-stakes part of the gene patenting game, I think, is embodied in these method claims. Now, earlier today, there was a question, would we have tests for BRCA but for the patent incentive? I think there's a decisive answer to that in this slide. This is a survey that was done of lab directors in the United States and Canada, I think, that was done by Mildred Cho and her colleagues. And the column that matters here, I've oversimplified what they've done, but I just took out the essentials here. This is the number of labs that stopped doing something when they got notification letters from patent owners. That is, those who had been licensed or had exclusive rights to diagnostic gene patents. And you'll see the ApoE led to the withdrawal of 9 laboratories from doing ApoE testing. And you'll see that 9 labs were already testing for BRCA when Myriad entered the game in 1998, and these 9 labs pulled out. So what does that tell you? It tells you didn't need the patent incentive to get to the market. If you did, those other places wouldn't have done it. It doesn't tell you that you would have a Myriad genetics that would have been able to make the discovery in the first place. It could well have been the prospect of patent rights that led Lilly to give them $5 million and that led private investors to create the company in the first place. And but for the patent incentive, we might not have a Myriad genetics at all. But what we do know is that other people would have discovered the gene within a relatively short time, and there would be tests on the market. So this is not a case where we're getting a product or service that would not otherwise exist but for the patent incentive. Moreover, it also tells you, interestingly, that exclusivity isn't leading to the first-to-market leaders. This means that you're following other people who are beating you to market. This is an unusual feature of the diagnostic market. This is to remind me to tell you, we studied 10 clinical conditions when we did our work for the Secretary's Advisory Committee, and the group at University of Louvain that has studied diagnostic patents more generally, they took the 22 most commonly tested genetic conditions, and they tried to find all the patents that were associated with those. They found blocking patents in 16 of the 22 conditions, so more than 3/4 of them. And this is probably the best empirical work that's been done, the case studies that are kind of telling the story and the empirical work of the Levin group. And this is the kind of slide that you show on a paper again that you shouldn't show in public, but I summarized it here. So let me just go through. We did do 10 clinical conditions. We tried to gather all the intellectual property, and we tried to figure out how it had been used in the real world. And we published those in a supplement that came out last April. And I'm simplifying and distilling what I think the main lessons were. Is we came up with a bunch of scenarios in these 10 case studies. Sometimes there were patents that were never licensed, like Forte Sachs. Sometimes there were no patents. There are a lot of actually genetic conditions, especially rare ones, where nobody bothers to get a patent. And then there's no intellectual property story. And yet, often there are genetic tests that are developed for that condition. Sometimes we have patents with non-exclusive licenses. I'm going to come back to the CF model in a minute, but this is also true for Huntington's disease and colon cancers, among the ones that we looked at. And then we get to the ones that are more controversial. And all of the controversy has focused on these exclusive license scenarios, where there's a single provider of genetic testing for a group of conditions that is enabled by the exclusive rights to patents. So that happened for a while in hemochromatosis. HFE is this gene that, when mutated, causes the most common form of hereditary hemochromatosis. There are about 30 genes, and it's going up every month, that underlie conditions of arrhythmias and rhythm disorders in the heart muscle. One of the forms of those is long QT. It's the most common. Lots and lots of genes, but there are only 10 of them that are fairly common. For a long time, from 2002 until 2 years ago, there was a monopoly that was held by PGX Health on those tests in the United States. And then that monopoly was broken when another company got countervailing exclusive rights, and they're in a Mexican standoff now. So you can get GeneDx and PGX Health are both offering tests for 10 of the forms of long QT syndrome associated with the 10 most commonly mutated genes. And then Canavan's disease was very controversial until an out-of-court settlement was reached. It is now apparently non-exclusively licensed. It's a secret agreement, so we don't know the exact terms, but it is widely available from multiple labs. And then we have the ones where there is right now a sole provider. And these are the ones that remain controversial. BRCA is head and shoulders the most talked about, but also spinocerebellar ataxia. This is another thing that's caused by up to 30 or 40 genes that are already known, and we already know that there are other genes yet to be discovered. And then Alzheimer's disease, there are 3 autosomal dominant forms of Alzheimer's disease that are very, very rare, not much of a market, but there are genetic tests for those that are offered by Athena. And then the very common form of Alzheimer's disease, late onset, where you can test for a risk factor, the E4 allele of apolipoprotein E. So that's where most of the controversy lies. So what are the controversies? Well, the first one that usually comes out is, gosh, a monopoly leads to too high prices. One of the surprises in doing our analysis was, in fact, the unit cost for testing for BRCA1 offered by Myriad, its unit cost for the amount of the size of the gene and allowing for all that stuff, the complicated tests, the way you get reimbursed, actually was a little bit cheaper at Myriad to get tested for BRCA than it is to get tested for the colon cancer tests that they offer at the same company. We can't do that same comparison anyplace else, obviously, because they're the only ones that have the rights to the BRCA test. But that was surprising because it suggests that their pricing is not, it's probably what it would be at university labs for the BRCA analysis if that were being done at other laboratories. That's probably not because Myriad's being generous. It's probably because once you've got a price point, everybody goes up to the highest price point they can get away with when they're charging for a service. The reimbursement system is paying at that level now for colon cancer testing and breast cancer testing, so everybody's going to enter at that level if they can get away with it. But it does say that this is not a classic instance. This is not what you would see in a patented versus unpatented drug, where you'd have a 7-fold or a 10-fold or a 30-fold increase in price in the difference between patented and unpatented products or services. There's a lot of talk about incentive to innovate. I actually do not know an empirical way to decide this. I don't know how to study this in a way that would credibly say where you could do a nice counterfactual analysis and say the world is in one way here with patents and this way without patents, which way works better. I do not know how to design that study. You can get indirect evidence on that, and I have to say I think it's equivocal. Although many people would disagree with my judgment on that. Some of the strongest and most vigorous claims, if you read the language in the case and in the public literature in particular, is that it impedes research. I'm not sure there's very strong evidence for that, except in the area where genetic testing is a part of doing the research itself. There it's very clear that Myriad asserted against University of Pennsylvania, and in fact, they did stop certain lines of research unless the testing were done by them. In return for getting the monopoly there too, they offered a tremendous discount, a factor of 3 discount, for grant-funded research that involves genetic testing for BRCA. One of the controversies that's getting a lot of play, if you read the AARP amicus brief that was sent in December, it completely focuses on this issue of verification testing. That is, if you've only got one provider of a service and you want to get a second opinion, you want to give that sample to another lab to see if they come up with the same answer, you can't do it because they haven't licensed out the rights. Myriad's take on this is that it doesn't happen. Myriad's take on this should be, if it does happen, go ahead and do it. They could solve this problem by the stroke of a pen, and I don't know why they haven't, because it doesn't affect their business plan. They've already got their money. And I actually truly don't, except there may be some liability concerns and things like that, but I think this is actually just dumb business decisions. Clearly, one of the arguments is that it reduces competition. Well, duh. It's a patent. That's what it's supposed to do, right? So this is not a surprise. The place where you might really care about that, the thing we really worry about in patents, is if somebody has a patent on something and they aren't doing it in the real world, so there's no access to that thing in the real world. The only case of that we saw in the study, in the places that we looked, was for a 2-year period, there was no test on the market for long QT. Now that's a really big deal if you're in one of those families, because this is a condition that can be treated, and the consequence of not treating it is sudden death. This is a really big deal. So there's a debate in the literature about whether that 2-year window, whether there would have been testing or not that was good in the real world, but it is clearly bad if you are enforcing your patents and you don't have something on the market, and that is what happened. For a 2-year window, there was no product on the market, and it was because of notification letters that were sent out by DNA Sciences. And the companies that eventually put it on the market took 2 years. It was hard to get this on the market. And finally, I actually think the biggest case against gene patents on individual genes is the one that is going to surface in the next few years, which is that it could get in the way of the kind of diagnostics that we know that we need that involve many, many genes working in concert, where you're going to be testing multiple alleles or doing full genome sequence analysis. And you've just seen the claims that I showed you. Those claims are infringed by doing that kind of testing if you read the plain language in those claims. Now, I don't know how the courts are going to interpret those. I guess they could interpret them in a way that they are not going to be deemed infringed. But my reading of those claims is that they would be infringed by full genome sequence analysis or any way of measuring the sequence of DNA, including single molecule sequencing, nanopore sequencing, whatever. So if that's true, it could weaken the incentive for the kind of innovation we really want right now. If the problem is what Becky described in 1998 in the Anti-Commons paper, is you need to aggregate 100 gene patents before you can go forward into the market with a cancer screen for 100 genes. If you pay 1% royalties for each of those 100 genes, you don't have a product because you're eating up your whole product revenue stream in paying for licensing revenues. Now, are there solutions for that? Sure. You can pool patents, you can have ceilings on royalties. These are standard things that have happened in other domains of business, but it's new to this domain of business. And we would have to see business models begin to emerge that allow that to happen in the real world, and we haven't seen that yet. So I've just given you a whole bunch of arguments about, oh my gosh, gene patents are terrible and the world's going to collapse in a heap. These are the arguments that have been made in front of the court system if we allow gene patents to go forward. I'm going to now give you a counterpoise to that, which is, why did I write an amicus brief that said it's not a good idea to ban the patenting of DNA molecules? I have a lot of people. I didn't get a single person at Duke University to sign on to that amicus brief with me, although I talked to 5 or 6 people about it. All the people to the left of me really don't think they think I went into the wrong pool by signing on to that amicus brief. But I believe it. So why? 2 reasons. One is, here's a case where you discover the CFTR gene. And at the time the discovery was made, it was obvious that it would also be useful for diagnostic purposes. But at the same time, the thinking was, this might be something that you could put into lung epithelial cells and cure cystic fibrosis, if you could figure out a way to do gene therapy. So you're going to patent this, you should patent this molecule. And it is going to be the molecule of DNA that's going to be key to the cure, right? Likely. You're going to want to patent that, because if you're going to prove that that's safe and effective, you're going to have to put it in people. It's going to be really expensive. You're going to have to develop the vector, the cell line, and the clinical protocols that allow you to treat cystic fibrosis. You're going to go through clinical trials that are going to cost $15 million, $100 million, and you're going to spend a lot of money, and at the end of the day, if all anybody needs to do is copy your DNA sequence and put it in cells without going through all that R&D, you've got the classic argument for why we need patents to develop expensive therapeutics when they are FDA regulated. And I actually think that's a big deal. I think it was smart and good for the University of Michigan to patent the CFTR gene for gene transfer purposes, for therapeutics. Moreover, it turns out the same gene looks like it might be involved in response to diarrheal diseases. And this very same cluster of patents that overlaps with the diagnostic patents has been licensed for humanitarian use in the third world for diarrheal diseases that affect kids. That seems like that's pretty cool. And what that has done is it's actually created a zone of freedom to operate for the NGOs that are trying to develop that kind of non-profit motivated therapeutic. So same genes, but in a very different context. Now, why wasn't there a huge controversy about the fact that CF the gene was patented? Well, it's because Michigan and the University of Toronto decided they would license this non-exclusively for diagnostic purposes. So you can actually go to a large number of labs. They use different technologies to some extent, and there's a market for the technologies, and there's a market for different prices, and you actually have competition. So it doesn't mean that every time you patent something, it automatically leads to a sole source provider for a diagnostic test. And I actually think it's pretty cool that Michigan and Toronto make, I don't know, maybe they've made $10 or $20 million off of this. I think that's great, because that's gone back into research and it has rewarded the institutions that set the environment for that kind of discovery to take place. And frankly, Francis Collins gives all of his money, because he doesn't want to be conflicted with this, he gives all his money to charity. So that's gravy, right? All of his royalty stream is going to some charity somewhere. I don't even know which one it is. A third aspect of this story that I think is cool is some of these patents have actually been managed at different points by the CF Foundation. And they were happy that this stuff was patented, because that gives them control over the technology, and actually means that if somebody introduces a faux CF test, something that's crummy and advertised in the internet and says we're going to test for CF but it doesn't really work, the CF Foundation can be sure that they can knock them out of business. So there's a quality control aspect of this, and they've actually also been very happy to be directly engaged with it. The constituency that cares about the disease that is being detected is actually on the side of the patent holders here and at the table with them. I think that's kind of cool. So there are all sorts of features about the CF model that I think are good, and you lose all of those features if you don't have any patent protection at all. So that's one of the reasons. The other is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that is, I actually think there are some products that are made of DNA that might turn out to be really expensive to develop into final products and services, that will be natural segments of DNA, will be a part of the thing that is the invention, that are going to be expensive, and that we would lose the patent incentive to induce private sector investment in developing those. So let me give you a few examples. Vaccines are basically living things that you put in people's bodies to elicit an immune response. There are companies that are trying to develop things as simple as a stretch of DNA or faux DNA that would be derived from a natural sequence, the pathogen. And it could be that that kind of a technology would turn into something you inject directly into a person's body in some form, and that elicits the immune response that you want. I don't want that pathway to be closed because we've said DNA is magical and it can't be patented at all. So, and all the therapeutic, the first generation gene patents, I've already gone through that argument. I think it actually was socially valuable to have patent protection for things like insulin and growth factors and interferon and things like that, that were fully litigated, and the courts seem to agree with that point of view. Now, let's transfer that to diagnostics, and then I'm going to go into the BRCA case, and then we will come up for air, and you can go eat lunch. In the diagnostic case, can we say that there's a decisive value to having the myriad model in the real world? I think it's hard to make that case. For one of the reasons that I said is it's not clear that the exclusivity leads to first to market. It's not clear that it leads to any products that wouldn't otherwise be there, but I have to put a caveat in there. I don't know whether that's completely true, and I don't think anybody else on this planet knows either, that there isn't a single product that would not have been introduced. It could be that there are some products that have been introduced in the diagnostic space because of patents. I don't know them, but they might exist. But they didn't come to our attention. One of the other features that I find worrisome about the diagnostic case that I'm going to come back to is the role of academic institutions, because for the most part, the enemy is us. Most of the patent owners in this space are universities, and most of the groups against which these patents are being enforced are university testing labs. So this is tech licensing not being completely connected to the medical decision-making apparatus in clinical laboratories run by the same institutions. So quick rundown on the BRCA case, and then we will then make some generalizations. May 12th, 2009, the American Civil Liberties Union and Public Patent Foundation filed their case. A couple things to notice about that. This is not a classic patent case, and this may actually end up mattering in how the case is handled by the Court of Appeals. This is 20 plaintiffs that were collected. I got some of the emails that went out through Breast Cancer Action, the National Breast Cancer Foundation, stuff like that. I'm on those mailing lists. I used to study cancer. They were basically pounding the pavement trying to find people who hated Myriad. And that's actually not very hard to do. There are a lot of people in that category. And the categories are basically two classes of people that are party to this suit. One is a bunch of people who wanted to get testing for themselves. These are potential customers. These are patients. And another class of people are the people who wanted to work with the health professionals, the doctors, the lab directors, who wanted to do this test either for their patients or they do it in their laboratories. So you've got medical professional organizations and individuals, and you've got individual women who wanted to get tested, who are making up the plaintiffs. They were collected by the American Civil Liberties Union and the Public Patent Foundation. Why did that happen, and why did it happen in 2009 and not 1998 when all the other lawsuits were being filed? Well, because it costs a lot of money. It's $1 million any game. And ACLU didn't do this to make money, because that's not what they're in business for. They're in business to make noise. And I think it's a spectacularly successful endeavor in that respect. And I actually think for public policy purposes, it's fantastic. Because we're now having a debate that we haven't had for 10 years about what are we doing in this space, what should the rules be, and we're actually potentially going to have some case law, I don't know, but we might have some case law that would help reduce the uncertainty in this space, where there are active decisions being made by lots of biotech companies right now. Sidebar. just before coming up here, I read today's press report from Myriad Genetics, and they just hit $100 million quarterly revenue. It looks like about 80–85% of the revenue is coming from this one product, which is tied to the patents that they have. Their next largest product is testing for colon cancer genes, which looks like it's about 15-fold lower in their revenue stream compared to BRCA testing. So this is a one-trick pony company right now that's trying to turn itself into a more generalized testing company. They've hit $100 million a quarter, which is $400 million a year, and they're trying to enter the European market, and I'm going to touch on that in just a second. But one of the quotes from Peter Meldrum today was, if I had my druthers, I would not want to go into a new market in a heavy-handed fashion by trying to enforce patents. This is not the Myriad of 1998. This is the Myriad of 2011, and I suspect that perhaps they've decided they aren't going to do the same strategy in Europe that they pursued in the United States, which is go after every potential laboratory that's going to offer BRCA testing and try to knock them out of the market. I don't know. I don't know if that's what that means. It's kind of hard to know what that means. This is where we are. I don't need to go through all the arcana here, but I do want to talk about what the stakes are in the BRCA case. But before I do that, I want to make sure that you understand that there's actually a pretty good case that I want to go through both sides of the argument here. Myriad does a bunch of things that are really, really good for the world. And in fact, I would argue that genetic testing in the United States for BRCA is probably better than it is in Europe and in other parts of the world, because BRCA testing is done very good turnaround times, very clear clinical reports. And if you talk to the labs that do this stuff, or docs who order these tests for their patients, they say, Myriad does a pretty good job. And the reports come back to us clear, and that is not true, believe me, for many other genetic tests. And their prices are not outrageous. Like I said before, they're in the same range as other kinds of tests for similar genes. These are two very big genes, so the prices are pretty high, but on unit costs, they're not that crazy. It is quite clear there are 7,000 publications, at least, that mention BRCA 1 or 2. So it cannot possibly be the case that they have put the brakes on basic research, right? We can't say what that number would have been otherwise without patents, but I think it's a plausible case that a lot of stuff's been published. The thing you can observe, however, is almost all of that research that was done in the United States would have infringed those patents that I showed you, because you would have been making using those molecules. That's an infringement. And we don't have a use exemption for research in the United States. So those are infringing uses. That was done with the indulgence of Myriad. So that's both a positive and a negative. But the upshot is, I don't think there's been a big impact on basic research. I already said it may have blocked some clinical research. But here's the real kicker. And here's where we are right now. And it's linked to this press conference that I just quoted from Peter Meldrum. Until 2004, Myriad was contributing all of the data that they found when people submit their samples to them to public databases. So that if a woman got tested in Belgium or in Australia under a different IP regime, and they came up with what's called a variant of unknown significance, that is one of these mutations that hasn't been associated or not associated with risk of ovarian and breast cancer. It used to be in the United States, especially if you were an African-American woman, you'd send your sample to Myriad and you get an answer back saying, well, you've got a spelling difference in your BRCA gene, but we can't interpret it. That's called a variant of unknown significance. What happens? At Myriad, they put you in a category, and they look for other people, as they're doing all this testing for the whole United States, they're looking for other people that get that same variant, and then they're trying to find out, is this a harmful variant or isn't it? And over time, you accumulate the data about whether that's a harmful variant or not. So what are you doing? You're accumulating data based on your exclusive rights to the whole gene, but you actually can't interpret the data. But it still falls under your claims. So this is a gray area of the law, and what they are doing is leveraging their patent rights, which are going to expire in about 3 years, but they're going to have a database where they are the only place in the world that has collected all the information about all these variants that were an unknown significance. They were contributing those data to public databases until 2004. They stopped doing that in November 2004. So now what they have is a proprietary database that is leveraged off of their IP. And that's not going to be public. Now, a woman in Belgium who gets tested, and he quoted this, 30% of variants of unknown significance in testing in Europe is the current rate, compared to 2% in the United States. I don't know where that's going to take us, but what that means to people doing clinical testing in Europe is they aren't going to like this system, and I don't think women in the United States are going to be too happy with that system, because what it means is the only way you're going to be able to get access to that proprietary database is to send your sample to Myriad Genetics. And as soon as those patents expired, I would expect there might be some legal activity about whether that's a proper use of the patents, because the database will not expire. And if the practice continues, I think we'll see some legal activity there. And I'd be willing to take that case. Actually, I can't, because I'm not a lawyer, even though I wrote an amicus brief. And why do I hold that position? And how can they do that? They can't possibly have disclosed the clinical meaning of those variations, right? But the scope of their patents extends beyond what they were able to interpret at the time that they filed their disclosures, right? That's what it tells you. So it means that there are all sorts of mutations in those genes that they don't know how to interpret, and nobody else on the planet does either, and yet they've got exclusive rights to them. Is that good or is that bad? The courts are going to have to decide questions like that, because the way the claims have been allowed does cover those unknown, those kinds of variants that are uninterpretable until you do the empirical hard work. Two other things to point out. Myriad could have gotten rid of all but 2 of the plaintiffs in this case if they had done 2 things. One is to allow verification testing, and the other is to say, we don't block basic research. Those are their policies. They've said those orally. Their CEO, their clinical director have said that. They have never put it in writing so nobody can act on it. And if they had done that, all but 2 of the plaintiffs disappear. So I think that's something that was completely under their control. They could have completely undermined this lawsuit. Now they're going to live with the consequences of whatever happens. And I'm going to turn just for this last minute or so, because I'm what's standing between you and lunch. I want to focus on the part of the story that I think is most complicated, and that is trying to think through, and I want to help you think through what's a good business use and what's a bad business use of these patents, and think through the consequences of how they made decisions at Myriad. One consequence of how they handled their US patents is they, for all intents and purposes, lost their markets in Europe, Australia, Japan, and the UK. Why? Because the health systems there have clout, and they weren't going to pay Myriad's prices. And they have a system of healthcare that allows them to make those decisions, where we don't really in the United States. So the patent protection, particularly in Canada, UK, and Australia, is quite similar to in the United States, but their patents are not being used in the same way, and therefore they're not making money in those markets the way they might have if they'd been a little bit smarter about how they used it. And if you think about it, they have a technology that people in these families that are at high risk of breast and ovarian cancer really want. This could have been a hero story, and if Mary Claire King had been the person who crossed the finish line first, there would have been patents. They probably would have been non-exclusively licensed, and you'd be able to get BRCA testing at many laboratories, probably at more or less the same prices, but with a much lower level of controversy. And probably Mary Claire would have already gotten a Nobel Prize. She may anyway. But it would be a hero story of both science and clinical application. Instead, what we've got is a greed and grab narrative that is echoed through the media at every possible mention. So, and finally, when those patents begin to expire, their business model dies. This is 85% of their revenue stream. It's going to disappear when those patents begin to expire. Now, the patents are not going to expire with the first one, right? They're going to have certain rights and they can block certain things, but their monopoly model is dependent on being able to block all uses of the tests, and I don't know how the business models are going to adapt, but it will change, and the business model that they've been acting on for the last 14 years is going to die with the patent expirations. They're going to have to start behaving at least a little bit differently. So I am going to end with why all this patent stuff might matter in the real world. I've already talked about full genome sequence analysis and multi-allele testing, which those are the business decisions that are being made right now. And I am talking to company executives. We just talked to a guy in the VC business a couple days ago, and he's trying to make decisions about investment in this space. And there's some really promising companies that are trying to do 100 allele tests for cancer. And it would be really cool if we could get those onto the market. And those companies have done their scans, and they're saying, we cannot penetrate the patent landscape. We don't know what our infringement risks are going to be. And we're going to investors asking them to give us money. And we know full well if we start making money, somebody's going to sue us. So we've got the uncertainty matters. And it already matters now with the patents that we've got. It could matter even more when we have a new layer of practices in healthcare reimbursement, coverage, and regulation that could heighten the importance of clarity about where the patent boundaries lie. And that's because FDA has already announced that it's going to go into genetic testing space. It hasn't said what it's going to do, when it's going to do it, or how. But it's pretty clear. They've sent out the signal saying, we are going to have to start regulating tests in this space. And one reason is because there are a lot of companies that are beginning to enter it. And the money is beginning to go up. If you're following the companies that are doing genetic diagnostics, the growth rates are in the range of 10% to 25% a year right now. So that's enough to get people's attention on Wall Street. So if Medicare and Medicaid are going to start saying, we're not going to pay you for your tests until you prove to us that it works and you've done clinical studies, that's going to be really expensive to do. Patents are going to matter more. If FDA says, we're not going to let you go onto the market unless you show that what you're doing, you're measuring what you say you're measuring, and that it's safe for people and it works, and you can interpret it, then the costs are going to go up for development. And again, so those are two, reimbursement and coverage and FDA regulation are two reasons that it could become much more expensive to enter the diagnostic space, and at the same time, that diagnostic space is becoming more valuable because it's actually helping to make clinical decisions about very expensive drugs. So that scenario is where we are right now. So what I'm hoping with, and I will end here, is that 2011 we will begin to see some reduction in the level of uncertainty surrounding DNA diagnostics. That's going to have to start from two of these cases that are at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. One case was just decided last month, and that was Prometheus, and the Court of Appeals basically said for the third time, we really like diagnostics. We're going to allow patents on them. Prometheus, they basically upheld their previous ruling. They put an exclamation mark behind it. And now they have two cases in front of them. One coming up from below, the BRCA case, which is probably their best opportunity for laying down some patent law doctrine. And depending on how they decide it, I hope they do better than the Supreme Court did with Bilski. And then you have a case bounced down from the top, another case bounced down, Klassen, that might be relevant, and I hope, Becky, you're going to talk about both of those cases. Okay, so we've got a perfect setup. Go enjoy your lunch, and we'll come back and hear the pearls of wisdom from Dr. Eisenberg. Good night, everyone.